So welcome, Jen. Really looking forward to our talk, our conversation tonight on neurodiversity and adult development. And we'll be co-hosting together, so no worries. But if you want to start by introducing yourself and letting us know a little bit about you, that would be great.
Sure thing. I'm Jen Rice. I'm an American living abroad, currently in Egypt, and splitting my time between here and London. My background is 30 years of customer centricity and strategy, then executive coaching, and now I'm actually doing a startup using wearables in the culture space, try to actually measure culture's impact on business. And one of the groups that I really want to start with is the neurodivergent or the neurodiversity group. We'll go into definitions in a minute. And I will just caveat this by saying I am not the uber expert, but I am likely on the spectrum and ADHD and gifted, which sort of makes me like a trifecta. So I have my own lived experience, but I also have been coaching neurodivergent leaders as well. So I've had a really good view on how it shows up, and there's obviously a lot of differences, but there's also some commonalities. So I'm very interested in how it shows up within organizations and leadership and teams.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm wondering if there's maybe questions already. Any questions on what you've heard Jen share so far? Most people don't introduce themselves that way. So I love the uniqueness, and the transparency and just beginning already to give us some language around this. Did anyone have any questions for Jen from what she shared so far?
Or anything that, going back to the earlier discussion about what prompted you to join the call, if there's any particular burning question that you have or that you're hoping that I will address. I don't know if you want to walk through the agenda, Bernadette, and that way that people know at least the arc of the conversation that we're going to cover. And then if anybody has specific questions, I'll make sure that I address them at some point within the talk.
Great idea. So Jen's going to start out by talking a little bit about how we're wired, kind of defining a little bit about neurodiversity, how it's similar to biodiversity. We'll talk a little bit about that, but it'll be interactive as well. And I think we had some breakout questions, but I don't know if they're going to come then after the second part, were you saying? We'll go into what this might mean for adult development. Yeah, and then we'll wrap it up with talking a little bit about complexity and implications for change and or adult development around the topic that we explore tonight, wherever it ends up going. So kind of breakout rooms sprinkled in there. Maybe we do it all together, but I think one-on-one smaller conversations would still be nice, even with this size group. Yeah.
Nice.
So any other burning questions you want to make sure we cover? Okay. So onward.
I'm
Jan?
particularly interested in what you mean by neurodiversity and how it evolves, how it develops through adulthood, and through what adult development perspective do you look, and do you bring it into relationship with neurodiversity?
Bring it into how it affects relationships, you mean?
No, how neurodiversity either reinforces or inhibits adult development, and what type of adult development.
Yes. All right. Yeah.
So I wonder from what perspective you will start both on neurodiversity and adult development.
Yeah, we'll definitely cover that. And but I appreciate your question on the framing, so we'll touch on that. Great. Well, why don't we jump in? I thought that I would keep things relatively informal. So I am going to share, I'm obsessed with whiteboards. I used to draw them on whiteboards, but now I use my nifty remarkable tablet. So if everyone can see this, and that way I can draw and we can be more interactive with this versus a PowerPoint. So just some basic terms. Neurodiversity, really, all it is a normal variation in human cognition, and how we think, how we wired, how we process information. Neurodiversity and neurodiverse apply to populations or groups. So you can have a neurodiverse group of people who have a mix of neurodivergences. So a neurodivergent is an individual whose brain wiring differs or is diverging from the norm. So we don't say this is a neurodivergent population. We only refer to neurodivergent to individuals, and neurodiverse or neurodiversity applied to groups of people. So you can see here, there's nothing in here in these core definitions that imply a pathology or a deficit. There's a lot of talk right now in the ADD, ADHD community around that the name is fundamentally flawed. There's not really an attention deficit. It's a challenge in misplaced attention, and it's not really a deficit. It's just simply a difference. So we really like in the community just to, understand that these are differences, and they may or may not be challenges, and they come with both gifts and challenges. So with that in mind, I'm not a big fan of labels, because often many people can't be diagnosed. There's no official diagnosis for autism in women. The autism spectrum disorder, the official diagnosis was developed for young boys, usually white. So a lot of people of color have been left out of the research. Women have been left out of the research. Girls have been left out of the research. So they're now trying to fix that, but we still don't have a good diagnosis for either autism or even ADD. So ADHD, which has the hyperactivity, that's the common assumption of people thinking about the hyperactive boy. ADD is it's called the inattentive type. It never occurred to me that I could have ADD, because I could sit and read novels for an entire day. So there's a function in ADD of hyper focus. It's when it's like a misplaced focus, and we're very interest driven, meaning if we're not interested and it's not really gaining our attention, we're not going to pay attention at all, or we're off doing something else. So there's a lot of misunderstandings about and kind of generalizations about neurodivergence, neurodiversity, and a lot of it comes down to there's not a good understanding, and there's generalizations made in the media. Any questions about definitions?
Yes, if I may ask, you said it's about variation in how we process information, and you refer to a kind of a norm. Could you tell a bit more about what, according to you, is a norm?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And this is where it gets very interesting, because if neurodiversity is like biodiversity, then you might have it's almost like the bell curve, right? And you've got some majority thinking. We call those NTs, or neurotypical. So you'll see the ND, neurodivergent versus neurotypical designation quite a lot. In a very strict form, neurotypicals are defined as anybody who does not have a diagnosis. In the more broad use of the word of neurodiversity like biodiversity, then I would also include in this list gifted, intuitive. So intuitive, if anybody knows your Myers-Briggs type, there is kind of a loose, there's a lot of problems with Myers-Briggs. I won't justify it, but enough people have taken it where we know that intuitives are only 20% of the population. So if you tend to be an intuitive pattern matcher, you are a minority within the general population. Versus the neurotypical, meaning 80% of people are not, well, and actually I'll get to this on the next page. They're not necessarily intuitive or abstract thinkers. They're much more tangible, sensing, categorizing. So we'll get a little bit more into the differences in the next topic, but I do want to just suggest that there's a pretty broad, most people don't consider themselves neurodivergent, and yet in these circles that we change makers, there's often, especially with gifted, but a lot of neurodivergent humans have a strong justice gene that's actually genetic. We're born with this justice gene. We often think in systems, we're often intuitive, or we're often abstract thinkers or pattern matchers. All of those are minority thinking styles.
Yeah, I was surprised, like even the language that we use, like to see the word gifted. I mean, that's so already biased towards someone has a gift. But what does that really mean, to unpack that, A? And then the second comment I had about that list was that I would never have put highly sensitive people, which I consider myself, on this list either, as well as intuitive. I had never thought of it on this with this kind of framing before.
Yeah.
And we do have a comment from Vitali saying this seems to me labeling people into categories, and Jan is agreeing. This has nothing to do with how the brain is wired. So this is happening in the chat. So maybe you want to speak to that.
Yes. So Vitali, I'm in agreement. I don't really like labels. They're pros and cons. I will say, when I had a realization, I actually had a girlfriend tell me that she was on the spectrum, and I likely was too. And I was like, I have never heard of this before. And when I actually did some research into the labels, a lot of my life made sense to me. And this is what is often this experience of kind of liberation and self-discovery, when you finally, realize, oh my goodness, this is why I've struggled my whole life. And it can be incredibly empowering for people. But the label can also be extremely limiting, especially when there are assumptions and generalizations about what that label means to different people. So there's good and bad mixed up in this. Jan, if you can, nothing to do with how the brain is wired, what do you mean by this?
There is a lot of research on how both hemispheres, brain hemispheres, function. And it seems that, for example, introversion or intuition or being intuitive is wired in both brains, but still both brains have different functions. For example, the right brain is wired to comprehend, to take a full account of situations, while the left brain helps us to apprehend, to manipulate reality. And the labels that we use are often misleading, because they do not reveal something about how we pay attention to the reality around us. And so it makes us very difficult to understand how our perspective is shaped and how this shaping of perspectives evolves during our lifehood as the brain changes throughout our lifehood. For example, the left frontal lobe is growing a bit bigger while the right back lobe is also growing bigger, which does, in a certain sense, does not make sense since the skull is symmetrical. And so brain researchers started to investigate how the different functions in the brain get connected through the corpus callosum. And for me, that kind of research is related to the neurology of the brain, but I understand that you have a completely different perspective, that you do not depart from brain research.
No, I think brain research is essential, and there are and you may know more about the brain functionality than I do, so I'm not claiming to be an expert. There are definitely some differences. So even biological gender differences, like those born female often have higher connectivity between brain hemispheres, while males typically have more connectivity within hemispheres. There's definitely there's also a challenge with, and I'll go to the next slide, around executive function in the frontal lobe, which typically there is within many neurodivergent deficits in the executive function. The frontal lobe is underdeveloped. So there are definitely structural changes. And then there's one in here on sensitivity that I have, basically this one, and executive function. And to a certain extent, I think that this intersectionality could also apply, but sensitivity, one thing that tends to connect almost all of the labels is an enhanced sensitivity, whether that's environmental or you're just taking in more information. So there's something called low latent inhibition, which I find very interesting. Essentially, brains all have filters to filter out irrelevant information, and some people have their filters allow more information in. For those with higher working memory and intelligence, we're able to harness all of that additional information. Often we tend to create patterns, or we might categorize them in different ways. But that is also a structural difference in brains that lead to neurodivergence. There are other things that you mentioned, like in personality traits have nothing to do with, with neurodivergence. You could be an extrovert or an introvert, and you can be neurotypical or neurodivergent. It doesn't really make a strong difference. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think there's a both and in here, that some of these are actually emerge from definite structural differences, and others not necessarily.
So let's go to Maria, just to keep it flowing. She has her hand up.
Yeah, I just want to not maybe asking, comment from Jan's reflection. And one reflection that I had, and that I actually arrived with also, that actually adds on my interest for this topic, is connected to myself and my own interest in adult development, and also the kind of people that I engage with within those kind of circles. And I think, it might be, when you compare different paradigms, that all of us that actually are like nerdy interested in this are on the spectrum, because I have, like all my life, struggled with different diagnoses and wondering what is wrong with me, until someone told me, oh, Maria, it's something called development. And then I started to be nerdy in that. And then I started to get to know other nerds. And then I work within a university, and I get to understand a bit about how the brain function, or what we think, how we make sense of the brain. And I think all those kind of different theories are like, well, interesting, but also I'm like loop around, and I'm so thrilled to hear you, Jen, develop those thoughts about how adult development and neurodiversity meet, and maybe also about the brain function. But
Yeah,
that
I think we'll definitely get to that topic.
Yeah.
I thought that there's a fair amount just to unpack in the beginning, just to get a good understanding, because it's not easy to wrap our arms around. So definitely that's we want to spend some time on the adult development. And I think there's advantages and also challenges for neurodivergence with adult development. So this right here is basically, and this is why I think it's also very difficult it's easy and hard to generalize anything around these differences. And actually, Jan, yes, this is a bit of these polarities, right? So thinking, you could either think in boxes or intersections. So I like to frame this up in terms of intersection players. My suspicion for many of the people here, and I love a show of hands, like, do you tend to see patterns and how things are connected, and you enjoy not being in a box, but rather seeing how boxes are connected? Or are you a hyper specialist who really can just go very, very deep into a particular subject? Curious. So typically the intersections players and pattern matchers, and this is interesting for organizations, because most organizations are built, and this kind of goes into the conversation around complexity. A neurotypical way of organizing complexity is categorizing and hierarchies and putting things into boxes. A neurodivergent approach to managing complexity is seeing what's the bigger pattern that we can see and manage to the pattern. So we can talk a bit more about the implications of that in the complexity theory, but for the most part, the NDs are at this end of the spectrum on the right. So thinking, there's top down and bottom up. So I worked at a consulting firm where they insisted that the proper approach is to generate a hypothesis, and then we break things down into its component parts, and then we prove or disprove the parts. And their theory is, we don't want to boil the ocean. We don't want to tackle too many things. Well, the way that I think, and this is a very typical neurodivergent way of thinking, is I can consume lots and lots of information from many different sources, and then I build the patterns and I build up to the higher level pattern, right? So it's a bottoms up way of thinking. It's very classically neurodivergent, where the neurotypical way of doing it is they don't get into the weeds. They start with a hypothesis and then go downwards. Does this resonate? Is anybody a bottoms up or a tops down thinker? Does that make sense?
So how would you like people to indicate? Do you want them to unmute themselves and say something about it, or raise a hand, one or the other? Yeah.
Good question. Okay, why don't we do hand raise if you resonate with bottoms up?
Really, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm really not sure on that one. How about other people? Yeah. Bottom up.
Or if you have questions, if it makes sense.
I think it's very much context driven. This is in some situations we're going to be very much top down, emergency situation, under stress, other situation when I have time, I can be all bottom up for years. So it really depends on context, you know?
Yeah. That might mean you are, and by the way, these are not binaries. So you bring up a really good point. There are plenty of people who can flow back and forth. I am somebody who was forced to learn top down, and I can do it, but only after doing bottoms up first. Like my brain just doesn't work in a top down way. I can't start that way. So really understanding, especially in an organization, insisting that someone you follow a certain process when they're literally incapable of following that process can be really toxic.
It's also a level of maturity that we can increase the agility of the people to work in both polarities, you know, because one is not better than the other, right? I'm assuming that's what you're saying.
Yeah. No, and I think within teams, what's very important is understanding the combination of the strengths. So for example, then the next one down, linear or nonlinear, the environment that I was working in was very toxic because I am a bottoms up nonlinear thinker, working with a lot of people who are top down linear thinkers. I went home in tears every week for 2 years, thinking that I was deficient and stupid, even though I'm not. But it took me a long time to actually recover from that toxic environment. So I think what's really essential in within organizations is what is the person's natural thinking style, and just because most people are top down and linear, don't assume that that's where everybody is. So if we have a mix, the linear people tend to tell stories better. Like they can actually string together this lovely story for clients. And I'm all over the map, right? I'm go from A to M to Z and back around to A. Yeah. So having that mix, I think, is very important. We talked about sensitivity. Empathy is one that is often misunderstood. So, for example, there's a lot of discussion where autistics lack empathy. I think how it shows up for me personally, and actually for a few people that I know, is it shows up in two different ways. If I see somebody who is authentically showing an emotion, my mirror neurons, like I mirror what they are feeling. It's very difficult for me to see innocent suffering. It's very difficult for me to see someone shamed because I just feel exactly what they're feeling. But in an organizational, or if something requires me consciously trying to walk in their shoes, I have a very difficult time with that. To see something from somebody else's perspective. And I'm old enough now to know why it's important. And I have to really expend a lot of energy and ask a lot of questions, but it does not come naturally to me. So that means sometimes I can come across as cold and unfeeling because it's just, I'm kind of oblivious, right? So some people might say cold and unfeeling. Other people see me and say, oh, I have so much empathy in my coaching. And it is contextual and through intention. Makes sense. Interest, special interest. This is usually a joke in the autistic or even ADHD community because we're very interest driven. So we talk about going down the rabbit hole. If we grab onto something that really sparks our interest, we'll spend days just diving in. Some people just stay in that zone. So the assumption about like the autistics are all computer programmers who sit in the dark and don't talk to people, of the specialist and meanwhile, there are generalists like me who, yes, I have some rabbit holes that I go down in and hyper focus, but I'm very generalist and I'm very pattern matchy. And that's often not a persona that is even people even know about. right? And it is a neurodivergent capability. So again, these are essentially just some observations that I've had on the differences often between neurotypical or neurodivergent, but it's not necessarily set in stone. So you can have autistics who are specialists and autistics who are generalists, right? But these are some common themes.
Great. So John was asking in the chat about some things around adult development and reductions, but I think we are going to get there. I'm not sure where, if we
I think we're
wanted
ready
to pause here. Let's just go into that a little more, and then the conversation will flow. Yeah.
But I do, Jan, I vehemently agree with you. The norm in nature is intersections and interdependencies and emergence. And I'd love to talk more about this in the last section on complexity, because this world that we see of silos and binaries is actually a neurotypical creation. Like the world that is in existence right now was built and created by the majority of people that don't think in alignment with the natural world. So I think that the future in a volatile, rapidly changing world, the future can be created by those who actually think in an atypical way for humanity, but a typical way for nature and how nature actually works. Strongly support your comment.
I wonder if working with polarities is so helpful to get there. Through using the polarities, you are moving the attention away from how we construct reality. You're simplifying reality through the polarities, and in doing that, even in teams, making those differences rarely helps in shaping the problem space and the solution space. Because people are both, always, both of the polarities.
Yeah, in the language, you see, you already polarized it in the language. Neurodiversity, neurodiverse or neurotypical. It's already a polarity. It's already started with a polarity.
Yes, I always felt that if I use such models, and I stopped doing that some 15 years ago, that it does not create a kind of a open dialogue, because people start using labels, and the labels get defined as a reality. So there's a kind of naive realism behind that model. And it doesn't enable us to make links with adult development, which is about how our thinking structures evolve through adulthood, how our perspective taking is changing and shifting to something different according to the different stages that we live.
So you bring up a really important point. So for starters, I'm fully in agreement on the labels. And I think there's some generalities and patterns. So for example, if we think about the typical distribution curve, you're going to have 80% of the people who are probably evolve in a typical way. And so a lot of times what we're talking about is the outliers. And there's also no real good term for the people who can straddle, I call them kind of the bridge builders. And I know a few who are sort of, their brains are different enough to where they can really communicate with the neurodivergent population, and they can also communicate with the neurotypical. So there really is a spectrum, and everybody is on the spectrum. So I do agree with that. There are, I think, challenges in neurodiversity for development that can, so for example, you take most autistics don't want change at all. So how do you bring them along on this adult development journey when they don't want to change? There can be a lot of rigidity in certain neurodivergent groups.
Can I add something?
Mhm.
For me, it sounds like you and Jan are talking about two different things. In what I can hear, Jan, you are talking about in a pedagogical manner and how to simplify too much and so on. And what I hear you, Jan, is trying to do is how do most people like think, or if you are like neurodivergent, like how do you make sense of reality? And that doesn't have to do with how you best work with development within groups. So for me, you're talking like Jan is talking here and Jan is talking there. And I'm trying to find out like, when are we going to get to the next? I'm really interested to hear you develop it further, Jan. But right now, I think you're talking about two different things.
Mm-hmm.
It's not either or. It's not the polarity.
Yeah,
right?
It's not either or. Exactly.
Yeah, no, agreed.
So
Yeah.
that's what I would say as well. And even I think it's just coming from another framework. It's still referring to a framework. The adult development framework of stages is still a framework. So all of this is reduced down to a kind of not reality, if you want to look at it that whole and that big. So we're all in that soup together. So if we just understand we are in that soup together, we agree to have a conversation, we're really just trying to increase our awareness around, and language is always limiting. And we do want to go into more of what this might mean for adult development. So let's do that. And then hopefully maybe
let's do that.
Scratch that itch of why, how does this connect?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
So I'd love to, just based on just this high level discussion about some of these differences, does anything jump out for those in the room that might be either strengths or challenges for adult development? And I have some ideas too that I'll throw in the mix, but I'm curious to know whether some people here have started connecting some dots.
What do you mean by adult development?
Did
Do
you
we
hear,
have a,
did you hear the
yes.
So
question?
no, yes,
So
what do you mean by adult development? I would like to understand that.
yeah,
how does this group define it?
what is our working definition in this context for adult development? Because Jen, you might have a different understanding of the word adult development than some of the people in the room. So I think that's the first step. That's what we're asking is, how would you define adult development, Jen?
I have long COVID, and like there are things that are not coming readily to my mind that I absolutely know. So why don't you guys start, because I'm blanking on
Yeah, why don't we maybe to save, I mean, one way to do it, and I can read them, is to just put into the chat what your understanding and working definition
That'd be good.
Brief though of adult development is, just to get the conversation going, and then we see who's in the room, what's in the room, and then we can go from there. That's a great question, a great starting point. So I'll read them for the people watching the video recording. So adult development encompasses the changes that occur in biological and psychological domains of human life from the end of adolescence until the end of one's life. From Wikipedia, from Nomali. Thank you.
I might also add that, you know, from a Robert Keegan perspective, I might just, I just saw Kate Keegan's model. Yeah. Just the fact that I think Keegan's research pointed to the fact that there was a general idea in psychology or in development in general that we stop growing substantially after like our early 20s or so. And Keegan's research was really trying to say that no, adults continue to develop and evolve throughout their entire lifetime. And so that sense of growth and evolution in an adult or after youth is perhaps what I would call is adult development. And there are many, many, many models that have attempted to measure what's in that development, what's in a stage, for example.
So we have, Keegan's model present in the room, maturity development, and then we need to define maturity, growth and evolution in the adult. Any more before we go into some observations of what might be then impacted by looking through this lens about adult development? And I know this is challenging. I mean, we're stretching a bit. We're kind of stepping out of the comfort zone, and I can feel it in, a little bit in the room. So just to name that.
Bernadette, I just want to say that I love this because this is something that I have been thinking about a lot, and there has been no spaces to discuss it because it's either or. It's all those people into neurodiversity, and then there are the adult development people, and there are no mix. So maybe we are starting something new. I love it. And it should be strange if it wouldn't be difficult.
Thank you for naming that, Maria. Yes, absolutely. There hasn't been space to try to bridge these, and just to name that. Yeah, we knew this conversation would be a little edgy and that we purposely didn't, it's not a presentation. So your presence here makes all the difference and what you bring to this conversation. So appreciating your willingness to engage at the edges here. And Namali has a question.
Quick question. When you put up the previous slide, you asked the strengths and the challenges. Just to clarify, did you mean strengths and challenges for neurodivergence as far as development is concerned? Was that the question?
Yes.
Okay, so strengths for neurodivergent adult development and challenges for neurodivergent. Okay, got it. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying, because where my brain was going was for the field of adult development. So I also have a comment about that when it's time, but I don't feel like this is the place. So, okay.
So I'll just drop a few observations, I think, for me. So I mentioned that there could be autistic resistance to change. One strength, let's call it, and these are maybe different for different types of neurodiversity, but I would say ADD, ADHD has a massive craving for novelty. We get bored very easily, and we just have this like growth craving, because standing still is just not good for us. So we're very unlikely just to stay put, but we're constantly like, what's next, what's next, what's next. So there's there's that, right? For ADHD is always seeking novelty. And then the autistic resistance to change. So for those of us that have tendencies toward both, this tension is actually quite a challenge. So I have a resistance to change, and at the same time, I have this craving for novelty, and it shows up in different ways in different contexts. I would say there's something called the theory of mind, which I mentioned before around empathy. So this understanding of other people, and other people are different than me. So evolving into the, these stages where I am an independent person, I am different, and other people are different from me, and getting into this individuation can be challenging. And then, that continued growth, because often there's this blanket assumption that everybody is similar to me. There's not this understanding of the other. And that can be a challenge within neurodivergent.
Which then really does connect to some of the stage theory, that maybe when we look at these variances, the stage theory might not be as easy to or so clean, because we say for the person who has feels that they are different from the norm and has always kind of felt that, or if they have belonging wounds because of that, they may get stuck in that belonging sort of stage and not ever have that really fulfilled, and they might look highly individuated, but really haven't gotten that need yet for belonging. So it just seems like it just brings in the nuance that's been missing for me from stage theory, and so I just like opening up the conversation from dominant ways of thinking or assumptions perhaps around who we need to be in each of those stages to be evolved. Phyllis, evolved in quotes, I want to say. Okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking particularly about what you said that was so interesting, that that for someone who's both ADD and has autistic features, that there's this tension. And I'm thinking that a lot of it might be about interiority and exteriority, looking at it from what's going on internally in the mind, for lack of a better word, and what's going on externally in terms of the worldview and what's happening around you. You know, not only your own behavior, but the behavior that is reflecting back to you. I heard it also when you were talking about working, and you called it a toxic work environment, and that's your interior being faced with an exterior world that's very different from what is comfortable for you, or is something that you're able to really kind of cope with, that you go home with as a toxic environment, that somebody else might go home with as a nurturing environment. So I think that if it is framed a little bit differently, maybe it's a little bit easier to talk about it, that that there are things that happen internally with a person who is neurodivergent, in terms of the way that they see the world around them. And I feel like there's something in this that I'm yes, context certainly, but it's more than context. I think that it's more than context. It's really remembering that that there is an interior and an exterior. So the context is just as important as what the interior is. Yes. But you have to acknowledge both.
Yes. I think it's a little bit related to, I mean, one thing that I'm not sure about, there tends to be a lot of introversion, and therefore a lot of, awareness of the inner world, and that's also a minority way as well. But I also know plenty of neurodivergents who are extroverted, which makes it challenging because they aren't that aware of their own inner world. If they're extroverted, which goes a bit to this idea of self-concept clarity. So self-concept clarity is sort of like where the self-esteem movement started. It's very early in the research and literature. I'm really fascinated by it. It can be common for neurodivergents to have what's called low self-concept clarity, meaning I don't have a strong sense of self. So so going back to the stages actually can be stuck in socialized mind. So that was me for a very long time, stuck in socialized mind. I didn't really know who I was. And so I was a chameleon, and I was a great chameleon. Who would you like me to be in order for you to be happy with me? And I will just be that. Because for so long, and what we learned from a very young age is, how do we fit in, especially girls? The reason why autism is so underdiagnosed in the female community is that girls have a very strong need for the belonging and the fitting in. So who do we need to be? What do we need to do in order to fit in and make friends? So we've automatically kind of sacrificed this idea of that individual. So it may take neurodivergent humans longer to get to that individuated stage. A lot of trauma and complex PTSD in the neurodivergent world, mainly because we grow up different and we don't know why we're different. We can be shamed, we can be bullied. So there is a lot of that, and that can also inhibit that normal adult development curve.
Maria, yeah.
Yeah, Maria?
Yeah, Jen, I'm getting curious about your own developmental journey and how you make sense of you being on the spectrum and at the same time taking your own journey as an object. Will you get into that some?
Taking what as an object?
Like your own developmental journey, being on the spectrum as you just shared,
Yeah.
and how your sense making and meaning making have developed, making use of those.
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
that is so interesting, I guess, because not everybody have both those theoretical frameworks as a resource making sense.
Yeah.
So it would be really interesting to hear from you how you resonate with this.
Yeah, I was a big fan of Keegan when I started reading him, because it took me until I was in a codependent relationship with my mother, an only child. So I didn't really have any siblings. I knew I was different. And my family moved a lot. So I was constantly in a new school and always just looking outside of myself to how do I fit in? And I figured out it was by what jeans I wore. And if I wear these jeans, then I'll fit in magically. And so I couldn't quite understand why, especially, as I got older, how I just felt like I didn't really fit in. And so that was my entire focus of, definitely this low self-concept clarity. And I would actually try on different identities. So I was a Bible teacher, and I was an atheist and a Zen Buddhist, and I was straight and I was gay, but never bi. It's also quite common for gender fluidity or sexual orientation to be a lot more fluid and neurodivergent also. There's a big overlap there. So having a very difficult time owning my differences because that was not how I fit in. So it took me quite a while to reach this point, and I credit finally moving to San Francisco where differences are celebrated. And you could be anything that you want to be. That's why I also love London. There's just this incredible diversity that sort of gave me permission to really look and see what brought me happiness. One of the biggest things that made a difference for me is meditation, and most specifically somatic-based work. And so I'm now trained as a somatic coach because this process of getting into the body and not living up in our heads, but following that felt sense of like what a yes and no feel like in your body was groundbreaking for me. So I would say I finally started knowing myself at age 45. I'm now 53. I mean, this is quite late, but a lot of these discoveries, like my girlfriend telling me that I was likely on the spectrum, and then more recently digging into ADHD. So all of these insights kind of shifted me into this space where I call it like it's this individuated stage where I absolutely don't care if I fit in. I really care about belonging. But now that I know myself better, I'm able to see others better. And I know who my tribe is, and I know who my people are, and who gets me and I get them. So you know, I'm not going to say I'm at this big transformative stage. I've been really happy at this, you know, individuated stage, and I'm just hanging out here and, you know, helping other people get to this point. Also, I feel like I'm a bridge builder for this process for a lot of neurodivergence. But what I would say, this theory of mind, low self-concept clarity, a lot of complex trauma, all three of those contributed to the challenges. But this drive for novelty, and I would also say it's not even just ADHD, but even in gifted, there's this drive for growth. So I've always had this like curiosity and growth and drive to become. And I don't know how common that is either, but you know, that I would say would be a strength, overcoming those innate challenges. I don't know if that lends any insight to you guys, but I'm curious what else might this spark in your own work around adult development? What ideas or questions come to mind?
For me, the question now is around assessment. You know, when we look at sort of doing interviews for assessment for adult development stages, it feels to me problematic, can be problematic, even though it's supposed to be quite holistic compared to other assessment methods. In other words, it's not a checkbox or just fill in the blank, but actually an interview with someone speaking. But for the neurodivergent, I could see how that could easily be not work very well, and that then some misjudgments, or however you want to call the end result, the evaluation might be misinterpreted because of how their brain works in a situation which is kind of high stress. I mean, for those individuals, that would be stressful to say, well, we're going to look at your, you know, where an assessment of where you are in your development. And so for some brains, that would be like, no problem, bring it on. And for others, it would cause the brain to go into distress, which would then provide a different outcome. So assessment seems a little tricky. I mean, it's tricky anyway. And now you add in this and it adds another dimension of trickiness, I think.
I think what's interesting about, you know, again, it's really hard. I can only give my personal perspective, and I think that of some of the people that I've worked with in a coaching relationship, but we love frameworks. So understanding this, you know, development curve and identifying where you are on that, I don't think could be stressful. What is stressful is just this not knowing how to, it's more of the how do you move into, you know, that next stage. But I suppose that would be the same challenge, whether it's like for anybody.
I think the question would be, why would you move to the next stage? What is the reason to doing that? If your life runs great and you can solve the problems around in your life conditions, why should you change? Yeah, you only change if you have problems you cannot solve with your setup, with your neurological setup, for example, or with your perspective taking, or with your cognitive thinking. So then something, because we know there are stress hormones in the brain, these are triggering neurological development, so to say, so you can achieve in a way the next level. Or you need somebody who helps you, like a coach, but the coach can help you best if he knows at which stage you are. So that would be a reason for me to apply an assessment on somebody. So I know, okay, this is the kind of perspective taking he takes. I know it very fast. I don't need 10 or 100 hours with him, so I just need an assessment. And then I can try to help him and open up to new perspectives, for example. So maybe guiding him from absolutistic thinking to a more optional view, right? So from polarity to you have options. There's not only right and wrong. But that is, for example, for that stage, the most difficult thing, because he believes this is right, this is wrong. There might be a God, or these are the authorities. And to get rid of them or to get loose of them, that means disorientation first, and then again stress. So, and you also need to know in that sense in which change state somebody is. If your life is running fine, you have no stress, you say my life is great, why should I change? Sun is shining, right? But if you have stress or in crisis or have a lot of doubts, yes, then you would like to change. But then what kind of change? Doesn't mean necessarily a development jump to the next stage. Might just be that you need to tune the flaps like at the plane, right? To get another course, not necessarily a second order change, which is massive. So there are different kinds of change, first order and second order change, right?
I'm curious because I don't have personal experience with being a neurotypical, like how most people evolve through the stages. But it would be interesting to know whether the challenges are actually not different at all, whether there's, you know, based on neurodivergence or neurotypicality. I think that there are some challenges. So you take somebody like my mother, who I'm quite sure is somewhere on the spectrum, but I haven't been able to figure her out yet, but an extreme rigidity, very, very rigid, non-growth mindset. It was a very fixed mindset, which can be indicative of autism. But then again, she's not, to your point, she's not interested in evolving to the next stage because she's made her stage work and she's okay with that, right? So if you look at people who are open to that evolution, does it even look different? The one thing that, and I'll close with this awareness. I have a what I call a whole mind assessment, which is understanding essentially different mind modes. So you've got the connector, pattern matching, versus the analyzing, versus how in touch you are with your emotions and how in touch you are with your body. And I find that many people, whether it's neurodivergent or trauma, have cut themselves off from the body-based wisdom that we have. And so a lot of my work is, in order to move into that next stage, is how do you unlock this latent wisdom that we have that lies within our emotions and our bodies. You know, maybe that doesn't need to be done in a typical fashion. So maybe there's some extra work that needs to be done within either neurodiverse or trauma experiencers.
Yeah, I would tend toward the latter. I don't, from what I've seen with the trauma work that I do, that it's not a pattern in whether you're neurodivergent or not, but it's more about the level of trauma and disassociation, disconnection from the body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and there just happens to be a lot of overlap in those groups.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to check in on time. We have 20 minutes and I just want to check in with everybody, you know, with where we are with the conversation. We also wanted to talk a little bit about complexity, I think, but I don't want to cut off the flow. Were you going to say something, Andreas?
Yeah, I just wanted to answer to Jen what she has mentioned about her mother. So there's a change state called flexibility, right? And you can have different perspectives on different areas of your life too, and you can be open, for example, to new political views, but you can be closed maybe to development of yourself, right? So there are existing states like open, arrestedness, and closeness. And if you are closed, you are rigid by definition, right? You don't want to move where you are. So, and that
Yeah.
can happen at every development stage. Yeah.
Mhm.
So that is also a spectrum. You are not either that or that. It depends on the situation of the issue and of course the development stage.
Yeah.
I found it really interesting just listening to some of the things that you were saying, Jen, as characteristics that even sort of within you or the neurodivergent person, it was just kind of interesting to me how when you said there are some who have the hyper focus, some who have the novelty drive towards novelty, like what's next, what's next, what's next, what's new. And I was kind of tracking them, and in my mind, it sounded like Enneagram types for me. And I know the Enneagram has no sort of scientific basis really, but I happen to love the Enneagram. It just feels like a little, sweet little tool that I always use. The hyperfocus sounded like the Enneagram 5 in its sort of average description. Then the seeking novelty, constant seeking of what's next sounded like the Enneagram 7. The one who is resistant to change and experiences a lot of rigidity sometimes sounded like the Enneagram type 1. And the low self-concept, clarity around self-concept, it sounded like the Enneagram type 9. And the chameleon, I'm always a chameleon, sounded very much like the Enneagram type 3. And then the one who I don't really fit in, I never quite know how I fit in, sounded like the Enneagram 4. So that was really interesting. If any of you are familiar with the Enneagram, that was interesting. And I'm sure if we had kept going, I would have found something for Enneagram 6 and 8 as well, and the 2, of course. But I am curious though to hear a little bit from you, Jen, around as you self-identify as a neurodivergent, what your actual thoughts are around, let's say, if you use something like spiral dynamics or Keegan's stages, what are your actual thoughts around development for a neurodivergent? Like how do you see your own development through those stages, if you do? Or are you actually suggesting that for a neurodivergent, those sequential stages don't really apply? Is that perhaps something that you're saying?
No, I think they all apply. I think that, and this is really why I was equally intrigued by the topic when Bernadette teed it up, because like she mentioned, this is a little uncharted territory. So I'm not sure I have a clear idea. I do think we move through the stages. I've definitely looked at spiral dynamics in my life. My personal life literally has gone through every single stage in that order. I don't know if there's necessarily a neurodivergent. I don't think that neurodiversity has any different type of evolution. But I do think that there might be some inherent challenges that for people who are working and have clients to evolve through stages, just being aware of what maybe some of those differences are and where people might get stuck, or because there's also this idea of getting to transcendent and how we're all part, or we're all integral and we're all connected. That is a huge strength of neurodivergence, because or many of us that are pattern matchers, and we see how everything's connected. We see how the interdependence, this idea of interdependence with nature and how all of that, the systems thinking is very much a neurodivergent writ large, not a diagnosis, but it is a very minority way of thinking about the world. So I think that we're innately, we are a minority that's trying to point out this is Bernadette wanted me to share this analogy of the of the stars, which I think really we're evolving now into this idea of managing complexity. So when I mentioned earlier that, you know, going back to this low latent inhibition, the amount of information that we get. So I'm here in Egypt, in the Sinai Desert, and I also spent last Christmas out in the Western Desert, which is a dark sky place. And you look up at the stars, and it's unbelievable. You can see every single star. You can see the Milky Way. It's the most incredible sight I've ever seen in my life. And then for the summer, I spent time in London with all its light pollution. I don't think I saw a single star the whole time I was in London, except for once, maybe. So imagine these two humans, one's in the Western Desert of Egypt, and the other person has spent their entire life in London with the light pollution. The person in the Western Desert is like, but don't you see this constellation and that constellation and this pattern and that pattern? And the person in London is like, I have no idea what the heck you're talking about. So this is where I'm getting to with, you know, this fundamental difference between neurotypical and neurodivergent in terms of we see literally possibilities that it is not possible, biologically not possible for probably the majority of humanity. They don't see what we see, no matter how much we point out the obvious constellations in our view. They have light pollution. Their brains aren't built to handle how we're basically processing. We're seeing different information, we're getting more information, and we're assembling that information into patterns that they don't see. So this has a huge implication for us who are passionate about making change in the world, that there's probably this kind of adoption curve. So personally, I'm like hyper pattern matchy. If I have conversations with people, so this was what was enormously frustrating for me in consulting, because almost all of my clients were neurotypical, and I would paint I created this whole model for the evolved, like a platformed organization that's fully integrated and unified. And I would just get this blank look from all my clients that they just did not get what I was talking about. So what I've realized is I need to spend my time with my people, and then we need to find like, what's the cascade? How do I communicate with other people who are better able to communicate with a mainstream audience than I am? Because I don't communicate with a mainstream audience very well. So who are your people, and then who are the next group of people who can straddle and be able to kind of spread these ideas and affect change that way? Because I don't think a lot of us can go head on and like try to convince people who don't see the world the way we see it.
Maria is asking a great question in the chat, and we talked a little bit about this question of can you become or gain neurodivergent qualities, abilities through development?
I don't know. I mean, I totally believe in neuroplasticity, and I'm actually reading a really cool book on it right now called Live Wired, on the incredible ability for brains to rewire itself. Over time, maybe, and I don't know how to do it. It's a great question.
Well, I know when we work with sorry, my mind just went blank as well. Otto framework, and looking at the 12 thought forms and the dialectical moments, that there are ways to help people think and see in the ways maybe that they're not normally thinking or seeing. So that's how we approach it in terms of cognitive development. Maria is asking, what is the difference between a highly developed person and a neurodivergent in terms of addressing complexity?
Great question.
Yeah, I love these questions.
Don't have an answer for you.
Maria, do you have any thoughts on that? Would you like to share?
I love the question.
Yeah.
No, that's why I'm asking. That's what is circling around my brain. the one who is solving that one gets a prize.
So let me, I'll basically share from my own personal evolution that Namali had asked me about. There was a time when, so I've been tracking through, let's say, spiral dynamics, and as a teenager, I was in red, and then I went through a Bible teacher phase, which was blue, and then I went through an Ayn Rand libertarian phase, which was orange, and then I moved to San Francisco, and I got plugged in with all of this awareness of, you know, eco. I got into sustainability, so I was firmly in green. And so I've been like in my life moving up the spiral dynamics stage, and I like to think I'm at least at yellow, which I do understand, like the different, I respect where people are coming from and the other different levels. I would say that when I was at orange, I was still a rock star pattern matcher, right? So I wasn't highly developed, but I had the brain capacity to at least process a bigger thing, which I think is what allowed me to move up into green, because at the level of green, you need to be aware of your interdependence and the life and system. So I think starting at around green, you need to at least have this ability, which might also be why anything above green is a minority often in even the general population. So I wonder if actually the system's way of brain wiring actually allows you to move into green and yellow and so on. That doesn't necessarily also mean that it's I mean, you could have a really, you could have, I don't know, can you have an intellectual yellow, but not be like emotionally fully developed? You could probably still have that.
I love that you're addressing that. There are discussions around that, and I think that is so great to address that. I think it could be, you know, that you're that or you're that, or and the question here in the chat, highly developed in what line of development? I mean, that is also simplifications to think, well, in that line of development, you are that and that, and so it's a mess. And just to understand that this is people trying to make sense of complexity in different kind of ways, but it's certainly an interesting conversation, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, and here we are full circle, you know, back to the issue of levels and lines and polarities and, you know, right back where we started. So yeah, there's no clear answers here, but it's to open up the questions, really. And so if we're leaving with questions, I think that's brilliant. That's a very good place to be. In fact, if we thought we had it sorted, I would be concerned. So we'd probably be going into the same traps. So I do want to end on time. We have 5 minutes left. So I would love to go into a closing round and hear just your thoughts of how you're leaving the meeting, anything that you wanted to say but didn't get to, as long as it's somewhat brief so we can honor the time. So whoever feels called to begin, then you can pass it on to the next person. You pick someone as you pass it.
I really appreciate, Jen, everything you've shared, and it's a sort of a new lens for me to think about, and just really a lot of empathy and appreciation is what I'm feeling. So thank you. And I will go to Phyllis.
Thank you. Absolutely. I mean, this has been such an interesting discussion, and it's so interesting to hear your experience sort of from both the living it and the looking at it. And I really appreciate it very, very much. Perfect. Thank you. And I will go to Maria.
Thank you. I just echo both of you, and thank you so much Jen, and I think it was both brave and so that you shared both about your own story and your own thoughts about those terribly difficult questions. And this is actually the first session that actually discussed. So I was thrilled, Bernadette, when you posted this specific. So I'm thankful to have had the opportunity to participate. Thank you, everybody. And I hand over to Andreas.
Yeah, thank you for the impulses. I haven't thought about all the topics you have mentioned in relation to development. I haven't thought about that. What I missed a little bit was that shift to how that impacts team and organization and what we can do about it. But yeah, was interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and just to spring off of, I think just the first step on teams is really understanding. So there's this huge push around DEI, but there's almost nothing. It's just starting to emerge around I think the fundamental differences are not seen. You know, everybody's focused on whether it's gender or race or LGBT, you know, it's a bit more visible, but so many of the differences in teams are powered through, you know, the invisible differences, whether that's brain wiring or even trauma or other things. And so just getting a better raising the awareness of neurodiversity within organizations and teams, and making sure that neurodiversity is not something to be ashamed of, but rather it is just this normal variation in human processing. And really talking about these differences in the strengths and what I've found is there's often not in traditional organizations, there's not an appreciation for the intersection player. Typically larger organizations are everybody stays in their box and their lane. And the neurodivergent who doesn't fit in a box, like me, I never fit in anywhere that I worked. Because there was just not an appreciation or a role for the way that I see the world. And I think that these intersection players are such a crucial part to any healthy functioning organization, to start knocking down the silos and really turning that into a system. So, I'm a big advocate for a lot of that. So. Yes. So yeah, we totally could have. And at any time, if you want to talk about this more, I'm completely open to having conversations around this topic. It's near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, I would love to explore that further too, the impact on teams and organizations. Talk about having different perspectives in the room and the value of that, of the multi-mind. So the more we can understand maybe how different minds work, we would welcome that. I think it would just help with our connection, trust, communication, brainstorming, innovation, all of it. And with this level of inclusion, including neurodivergent brains and so forth, or even just the margins outside of dominant culture on all levels, whatever that might look like, welcoming that into the room and see what's possible then. So for me, it's awareness building and see what we can create now, now as we learn, as we emerge.
And Andreas, you're absolutely right, because the neurodivergent becomes the freelancer. That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. And the organizations are really missing out because they don't know how to work with us. Yeah.
Or become the consultants. I'm laughing. All the consultants in the room here.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been great. I appreciate all of your participation and all the really good questions you raised, because I definitely do not assume that I know everything. Just happy to share my own experience, and hopefully it sparked some good thoughts in the room. And I will definitely be thinking about some of the questions that you guys teed up. So appreciate it.
Yes, thank you all for your contribution and for skating on the edge with us a little bit for the last hour and a half. So you can always send messages in the, in the emails I can forward them on to the group if you have
Mhm.
thoughts about this, or we could have a separate place to chat if you want to continue the conversation. Just contact me. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a beautiful rest of your evening.